Hello, I'm François Grey from the University of Geneva, and we're here recording the ReModelUN podcast from AI for Good and the WISES Plus 20 Summit in Geneva, Switzerland in July 2025. While we're here with Beth Noveck, a professor from Northeastern University and a real pioneer in the area of what you could call experiential AI. So teach people in new ways to use AI in project-based learning, experiential learning. And this started well before the current AI revolution with the Governance Lab, which Beth set up in New York at NYU originally, and now with the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. She's continuing the adventure. So welcome, Beth.
Thank you, François. Very nice to be here. Thank you. And you've gotten a lot of bio details in a short amount of time.
We'll get around some of the things you've done in practice as we go forward in this podcast. But first of all, you're here at AI for Good and WISES. What have you seen so far? Who have you met that was an aha moment for you, at least something that you were excited about?
Well, what's so great about these conferences like this, these large conferences, is all the people that they attract. So I confess that it's less about what happens on the stage and more about what happens over coffee, over free ice cream samples, what happens in the hallways. That's really the best part of things, is that events like this just become a magnet for so many people around the world, especially so many people who are focused on how we can use AI for social good. And that really is a very unique conversation when we think about the fact that most of our media coverage, I think globally, about AI is either about the robot apocalypse, the death of all jobs, the death of humanity, the rise of general artificial intelligence, and the, despairing predictions about the world takeover on the one hand. Or we tend to get a lot of product conversations, new product and its impact on the market, how much money we can make, what's the latest boardroom machinations of this company or that company. I think just the collective set of conversations of people asking, how do we use these technologies to solve problems in the world, to make people's lives better, to improve communities, are what's so exciting. And just very specifically, I've been really, really excited about this conversation around what's the role of students, what's the role of education, how does all of this opportunity around AI for social good really cause us to rethink what the role is of the university and how we're teaching people, because it's not just about using ChatGPT to write a paper or using Claude to correct a paper anymore. It's about rethinking, I think, the question of how we're educating students to learn by doing. Not new with AI, but I think AI brings new urgency and opportunity.
So true, and I think all universities are struggling with that, and I know Northeastern has a tradition of hands-on learning that is, I think, really well suited for this new era. So for our discussion today, we're here with Sharada Mohanty from AICrowd. AICrowd is a sponsor of this podcast, but also really, I think, one of the innovators in the area of online learning through challenge-based activities. Maybe a few words about AICrowd?
So at AICrowd, we gather hundreds of thousands of people to come together and focus on these hard research problems. And in many cases, we do not even tell them that these are these hard research problems. And while they're figuring their way out, they end up actually doing really well. Then we invite them as co-authors on this paper we write, where they document the solution space that they explored. In a way, also short-circuiting their career trajectories as like an interesting segue to get into research. But our goal has always been, how can we build a giant distributed research lab? The same way that you build open source organizations, right? Open source communities for software. Why can't we actually do research in a similar way where anyone has every right to jump in and really contribute and push the state of art?
And as a result, Mohanty has, I think, just as many citations as me. So I think it's a living proof that this new approach, crowdsourced approach to both to learning and to research, can be quite powerful. Moving to a second part of this conversation, which is deep diving into some very specific topics that you've been working on, Beth, where we'll be looking at what can be learned and what can we leave behind in terms of problem definitions for young people to really tackle new problems that we see on the horizon. last year, you launched a new course on Experiential AI at Northeastern, which brought together the private sector through the tools that the students could use, the public sector through problems that they were trying to solve, and at the heart of it, your students who worked in teams over more than a whole semester, I believe, to really try to find solutions. Could you tell us a little bit about what the outcomes were from that class and where you're taking that approach now?
So I've spent the last 20 years designing and running classes where students build technology with government or civic institutions. It's a phenomenal experience, I think, for both sides, in that the public sector or the civil society sector get the benefit of talent and technology that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, where they don't have people in-house who have the skills or the tools or the knowledge to build things they need, but they have the mission or the public purpose, the kind of vision for a problem that needs to be solved, which students can then help to tackle. For students, the opportunity is to go beyond what they typically do in a classroom setting, where they may write a paper that never sees the light of day, or they might work on a toy problem or a problem set, but they don't get to have that experience of taking something from idea to implementation. I think the really powerful thing is finishing something. It's having the sense of accomplishment that comes from doing something in the world, finishing what you set out to do, and then importantly, seeing it in use by real people in ways that improve people's lives. There's nothing like that gratification. Fast forward now to AI. So we call this our AI for Impact program. Because of the power of Gen AI tools to accelerate how we code, to accelerate how we work, we've now been able in the last 18 months of this program to not only design and build, but deploy 18 different products. So if you call to get health insurance now in Massachusetts, the person answering the phone to give you an accurate answer to your questions about your eligibility for something as important as health insurance, that tool is built by a team of 2 students from the AI for Impact program. If you're an engineer now going to work on building the highway system in Massachusetts, the tools that are used to train you to free up the time of senior people so that they can do more work on building infrastructure, that's again built by junior people from a team of students from the AI for Impact program. In New Jersey now, if you're calling to file a civil rights complaint because your rights have been violated, if you are trying to go online to get better information about our next election coming up, the tools you're using are things that have been built by a team of students. So it's really exciting because with AI, we can not only conceptualize the problem we're solving with our partners and build a fully functional tool and deploy the tool, but we even have enough time to do it in a human-centered way. That is, to interview and talk to and engage with the communities who are most affected, with the agency workers and public servants who have to deploy the tool, and to work with the tech professionals who help us in turn install the software on the right server, ensure that it has the necessary security, that it's integrated with the system in which it has to live, and probably hardest of all, that it's integrated into the day-to-day work of the people who will use the tool. All of that can now happen really in 6 months or, a few months more. That was something that was not possible before AI.
Fantastic. And they're really great examples, both from Massachusetts and New Jersey. And I know you're very active. You're in charge of a lot of technology and implementation in New Jersey. So these are public sector outcomes. How do you think they could translate to the international organizations that are omnipresent here at AI for Good and WISIS? Is there a route forward to use the same sort of approach?
100%. And our goal with AI for Impact, we've already started down this process, is to not limit participation to students from Northeastern. We started it there because the university has a long tradition of experiential learning. All students are used to doing this kind of paid, essentially full-time placement. But we know there are lots of other students who want to be involved and have these kinds of opportunities. So we have our first cohort of what in the US we call community college students who are starting with us in September. They will be part of the same program. And now we have many other faculty, professors, and campuses asking, how do we get involved as well? And of course, Geneva and the SDG Solutions Lab has been a pioneer in this space long before it was even called the SDG Solutions Lab. You and other colleagues of ours have been also pioneering in this experiential learning space, doing very similar kinds of work with students to come up with ideas, to build tools, etc. So we're very eager to expand this. And I think international institutions in particular are owners of a very significant set of challenges and problems. They have in particular audiences from around the world, including the most vulnerable populations, the poorest populations, whom they really steward their interests, and I think can bring to the table, affording the opportunity to get students involved in working on some of the most meaningful, hardest, and most interesting and challenging problems.
Fantastic. And Mohanty, this reminds me of a point you've made, and I think one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is that you've tried to have these sort of conversations with some of our colleagues from the international organizations, and it's not always easy to extract what the problem is and define it. Tell us a bit about how you see it from a developer point of view, these sorts of conversations, and perhaps how Beth's approach could be helpful.
So the way you were describing it, again, I resonated with it very strongly because I've actually felt the pain of different phases of it. When we have conversations with many of the international organizations, there's always a whole lot of enthusiasm and excitement about let's make this happen. But here I'm also talking from the perspective of me being responsible for managing a really large number of technical audience who want to come in and contribute. So they're being able to do this at scale where take this problem and present a clear, well-defined task to the problem is one way of doing this. But again, there's a reason we can approach it this way, because this allows us to create this very fast feedback cycle that we can provide to a large number of people, and that can arbitrarily scale. So if we have 100 people or 1,000 people or 100,000 people who are working on this problem, if the problem is really well defined, they get instant feedback, and then everyone can just self-organize around just that feedback signal and figuring out how to optimize it. Now the problem with scoping is how do we design those set of signals that we can allow them to optimize? And that also allows on how do you think of it as a product and how does it fit into the impact that this organization wants to create. It would be the research problems that we deeply and intimately understood, right? So we would go ahead and do that translation for the larger technical audience, defining the exact scope, so on and so forth. But now the problem owner from an international organization who deeply cares about this problem, intimately understands this problem, they do not understand the language in which you can really specify this well. The technical criteria or the evaluation metrics, much of the effort is figuring out how we are not the bottlenecks, or we do not rely on these organizations to be the bottlenecks at doing that scoping and the problem definition, when we have an army of hundreds of thousands of AI researchers really hoping to jump in on the problem. And there I really like your approach, right? Where I could imagine this setup where this initial scoping of how to just focus on a problem, define it well, happens while building the first initial prototype around it. But then after that prototype is there, we also want to build the structure around it in such a way that we are still measuring all the other things that are needed for the long-term life of a product like this. For example, in your case, when we have an automated bot which can give you information about how often does it get it right, or where does it make mistakes, what are the signals that we have to improve until a point that we can safely roll it out. So once we have built that first version of it and we have clearly defined, okay, these are the key metrics that we want to really observe, then we can basically mobilize a really large crowd to just go ahead and slowly ensure they're all improved. But what we are struggling with, our strength is being able to mobilize that second part of the process, but what we're struggling with is the definition of these problems, because again, that takes a disproportionate amount of time than we are used to.
And I think that gets to kind of what's maybe unique and different and difficult about all of this work. I think we all understand from years of work in the open innovation space and the crowdsourcing space that the definition of the problem is the hardest piece of things. So for AI for Impact, we're not just taking a team of students and sticking them on a project. We have a layer of professional, what I'll call them product managers or project managers, who have to spend a lot of time with the students and with the institution really doing that scoping of the problem. problem. And you need people who are not students in that process, because the problem definition process also requires saying no. It requires saying, no, this is too big, or this is the wrong problem we're solving, or we need more data. It requires some pushing back sometimes that students are not always as empowered to do, especially because the students are hoping to get a job at the end of the process with the client, which most of them do, I have to say. But so we try to inject some, gray hairs in the middle so that we have somebody who can at least do a little pushing on all sides to say, we need to work hard to agree on something that's actually doable in the time frame so we can get to a finished product.
And I think in your model, at least for that course, this injecting, as you say, the gray hairs is a really wise move to bring in this. We know that AI is moving very fast in the private sector. They have the tools, they have the resources. Trying to reinvent what they're doing from scratch is a waste of time for your clients in particular, but also for the students, as you say, to learn from what's happening in the private sector so that they're more job ready when they come out on the job market.
100%, but because we're also concerned about deployment of the tool, we start on day one, even before we've built anything. And we spend very little time, I would say, actually building. That scoping is 75% of the work, building is about 25%. We're already talking about handoff. We're already talking about deployment. We're talking about where it will live. So where the private sector particularly comes to play is because most institutions are running a cloud from a commercial provider. So they have an Amazon cloud, they have a Microsoft Azure cloud, maybe they're running a Google cloud. So for a tool to live in their environment and be usable by their employees as opposed to living outside in a university, we have to make sure we're having that conversation about exactly what server we're going to put it on, who's going to use it, what's the security. Those are conversations that happen on day one. Those very mundane cybersecurity, hosting conversations are happening even as over here we're talking about sort of a tool that will be used by ordinary people for some completely other purpose. We're talking about how do you deploy it inside an institutional environment from the get-go.
Fantastic. So at this point, I'd like to focus in on this idea that you've been mentioning about, instead of challenge-based learning or innovation-based learning, going all the way to product-based learning, which I think really sends a strong signal of where you're going with this. Now, obviously, not every course can be that way, and not every student team will get all the way to product, but it's a safe place within a course to try, and setting up the conditions, the framework, to make success really highly probable is, I think, the secret sauce you bring to this. What you mentioned that fascinates me and fascinates the ModelUN community that we're working with on this podcast series, their challenge is, ModelUN is all over the world, millions of kids do it, but they tend to be in wealthier schools, often private schools. They tend to be at universities that have the bandwidth to do this kind of thing. And it means there's a whole section of young people in education in parts of the world that just don't know about it and don't have the wherewithal to do it. Now, when we're talking about getting this kind of product-based learning into community colleges in the US, or you were saying other universities, perhaps universities with less means, what do you see as this stumbling blocks ahead, and how are you solving that with those organizations to make sure it works for them as well?
Well, to be clear, we're learning by doing, and ask me in a year or two what we've done right, what we've done wrong, and what we've changed as a result of the learning. I think one of the exciting things as we think about, and I was a big ModelUN person myself in school, I credit ModelUN with a lot of my career and kind of opportunities that came later, is a lot of the way we typically think about ModelUN, Model Congress, Model Parliament, this and that, is much more about knowing a set of jargon. Do you know what the Secretary General is? And do you know these particular words of parliamentary procedure? And those are the sorts of things that advantage kids who maybe grew up listening to the news or who grew up with exposure to these different kinds of environments. What I'm excited about with AI and with the tech dimension. In other words, if we said, look, what we're trying to do in our thinking about working with institutions is how we can also build tools, not just participate in debate. I mean, there are ways in which the tools already can help kids who maybe are less well-spoken, who don't have the same kind of training in forensics or in debate, to speak better, to prepare better arguments, to do research. So there's all of that kind of AI tools for parliamentary processes. But the idea of saying, hey, there might be an expanded vision of how we think about students working with international organizations or participating. I just think there's so much opportunity both to work on the platforms to give kids voice in new ways, and the opportunity to work on building things with institutions of different kinds that can afford opportunities to all kinds of kids. And you don't need a 4-year computer science degree or a PhD in computer science. You should still finish your PhD. But you don't need it anymore to write functioning code. And that, I think, is what's so exciting. What will be difficult is the finances, of course. And that's the big issue here. With AI for Impact, the students are paid a living wage so that they can work full-time on this kind of experiential product and process. It would not be fair or right to say that only students whose parents could afford to subsidize them to work for free. That's what's unfair. So if we want kids to have this kind of opportunity, then we need to subsidize it. And by the way, that is not hard. We have money in our government budgets for apprenticeships. We have money for training the next generation of talent. We have money for skill building. We care about ensuring the economic future of our communities. And so just recognizing that we need to redeploy some of that funding, which we now have under the umbrella of apprenticeship, or which we now talk about as building the AI economy, and redeploy it towards these kinds of opportunities, I think is really important. And by the way, working on public interest, mission-driven, public purpose, AI for good problems is a great way to give kids, students, commercial skills that, skills that they can use in the private sector as well as in the public, in addition to solving hard problems.
Fantastic. As usual, you're several steps ahead and you're thinking about this. And as you said, we'll see in a year or so how this works out. But we'll be delighted to learn from that, because the problem is compounded here with the international organizations by a tradition of not paying people anything for even for internships, which is very hard to change, especially at a moment when budgets are being severely cut. So looking for third-party solutions is something I think that we'll have to do, but then turning it into a program that really has a serious impact on what the UN does, not just tokenism of youth participation, could be the sort of win-win for this going forward.
But let me say that up until now, the student projects have been thought about as a nice to have, and therefore haven't been funded. But these same institutions are turning around and spending millions of dollars on McKinsey and BCG and Accenture and fill-in-the-blank consultancy, big tech firms to build them a content management system, to do their cybersecurity, to do other IT projects for them. There is no shortage of funding. And now we're talking about, with AI, the ability for students to build functional product. It is a cost savings to go this route. And that is why I would just caution that we not simply think about this as a class where it's easy to hear, oh, this is kind of a cute IT project on the side. We talk to our students about, we don't think about it as a class. It is a job for them. They get paid and they have responsibilities to the communities that we're serving to build something that improves lives for other people. So there is an obligation to finish something, which is good for the students, but it's also a cost saving for the institution. I just did a recent project where without going into the details, we did one version of the project using some open source AI and some students, and another part of the team hired a commercial consultancy. That team spent $1 million. We spent $20,000 on doing our project. It is a huge cost saving, and I think this is not about philanthropy. This is about more efficiency.
Right. This is a fantastic win-win for the education system at a time where there's also a budget crunch there. And this A/B testing that you're proposing is something we should be doing more of, and publishing. Perhaps business schools should be publishing this. So Beth, what you're talking about is really scaling up from just one university to multiple universities and sharing in an open way, which has always been your style. Mohanty, you see opportunities of scaling up, at least in a sort of microtasking way, some of this learning to much broader communities that go beyond universities. Can you say something to that?
Yeah, first I definitely acknowledge Beth's point and the observation that the overall, if there was a metric which measures the skill randomly sampled individual on earth has, that has aggressively increased. So our expectations from that should increase. A lot of my thought goes into, if we have to do this for not 100 students, but 1,000 students, 10,000 students, 100,000 students, how does the structure for that look like? And because again, for many of the things that we do on AICrowd, running something for just 100 people is very different than how we have to plan, structure it and think it through for 1,000 people. And regularly for AICrowd challenges, you would have thousands of people. And if I'm told that I have to gather and vet for 10,000 people who will go ahead and work on these AI for impact kind of problems, I will make it happen. But the question then becomes, do we have clarity on these 10,000 problems that we can map them to? Do we have the infrastructure to give them the right feedback, the mentorship for that to really flourish? The one trick that we use in context of AICrowd to scale that up is the feedback is automated. So we define the problems in such a constrained way that allows automated evaluators to give feedback that they can also validate. So in these problems, then the question is, where does the mentorship structure come from? So that the students who are even motivated, they do not lose the motivation just because they're a little bit lost. I also acknowledge the issue around how do you even finance something like this. What we do in AICrowd is slightly different, where we basically have large pots of prize pools like $50,000, $100,000 for a challenge, and it's still a winner takes all kind of solution because it is at the end of the day a competition. And we have experimented with different models where we give out hundreds of people these AWS credits, etc. But the financial structures also do not allow us to do that at scale. For example, at one point I said, you know what, if we're giving $100,000 in prizes, why can't we actually just imagine that instead of giving just the top participant $20,000, $30,000, let's just start by giving everyone just a few $100s, but a large number of them. But to do that right in the current financial structures is very tricky. I can kind of get around it by giving it in crypto, but then you do have your KYC obligations. Anyone who takes the prizes, depending on the country, you have financial obligations to the countries the residents are. So there's many of those things that we cannot address, even if we are willing to go ahead and figure out the funding to give out those prizes.
Yeah, and that suggests another conversation on, sustainable finance, which we talk a lot about here at AI for Good and in other contexts in International Geneva. It's a big hub for sustainable finance, impact, investment, and so on. At the end of the day, this kind of sustainable microfinance is what could make education at scale happen in new ways if we can work it out. But we'll leave that for another day. Our third challenge I wanted to hear from you about is, Beth, you mentioned on the United Nations was a big part of your youth, and it's followed you into friendships that you keep today all around the world. You can say a bit about that, and in particular, now that we are working with that community and that the topic of AI governance is on everybody's lips, but really hard to solve. The question is, in an MUN context, what would AI governance simulations look like? What sort of discussions should young people be having? Young people who use AI much more than the adults in the room who talk about AI governance.
Well, yes, and so completely agree that the topic, how we think about AI, the AI that we're buying, the AI that we're building, how we use AI, how we want to regulate and oversee AI, what some people refer to as AI governance. Some people now talk about AI sovereignty, depending on the country, the question of whose AI we're using. There's obviously the topic of open source AI and how transparent and open AI should be. Is it okay pay for the AI that is in our schools, that is in our governments, that we're using to essentially power our democracies, to be tools that are entirely commercially controlled, regardless of where the company sits that controls it, we wouldn't have our parks or our libraries or our highways or our energy systems run only, our healthcare systems governed only by private companies. We've seen what happens when we've done that with social media. We have seen what one commentator refers to as the dumpster fire of democracy that is social media, and how we all wish, gee, social media looked a little different than it does and we had more control over it. So I think a lot of people are asking these hard questions that range from what are we building to how are we governing and overseeing the technology that we build. I would say this isn't just about, though, what not to do, which is also the AI governance conversation, tends to be about what do we want to forbid companies from doing. I think the much more important conversation we want to have with young people is what are the positive things we need to be doing with AI? What are the investments we should be making in technology? What are the priority projects and use cases we should be building? How should AI be used in our schools and our universities? I think, to your point, kids are the users of AI. They are the builders of AI. They're going to be the generation, not in the future. Right now, we're using these tools. And so they should have a seat at the table in making these decisions and being part of the conversation. But the conversation has to be broader than just what not to do. The conversation really has to be consistent with how we typically think about free speech in Europe. Not just what do we want to forbid, but what is the positive use. In Europe, we tend to think about what's the positive uses of speech to promote democracy, to strengthen our communities. It's why we don't have commercials in the middle of football games like we do in the US. Football is considered to be a public happening, something that should not be interrupted because it is something that we enjoy as a shared pastime. So, short story long, absolutely talking about the future of AI, both the positive future and also what we want to avoid, is a phenomenal and great topic, I think, especially for the Model UN community.
Fantastic. And yes, it's nice that you have kind words to say about how Europe approaches it. Of course, Europe approaches it with a history of having seen what different types of propaganda can achieve, and the outcomes weren't so good. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity to what AI could be used for positively, because the negative is so worrying.
Indeed. And I wouldn't say that the current European debates about AI, I think they are too negative. They're too much focused on the risk. Not because we don't have to worry about the risks, but when we only talk about the risks, we miss the opportunity to ask, what are the things we're doing with AI, like on AICrowd, to solve hard problems, to advance scientific research, to improve how our institutions work? We're just not having those conversations, and therefore we're not asking, what are the investments we should be making? Should we be paying students to build these kinds of tools? We're not having the right conversations, in my view. And to Mohanty's point, we need a conversation, which AI can help us with, to really map the landscape of projects and problems, some of which would benefit from 100,000 people working on a crowdsourced platform, some of which need 2 people going into an agency to have in-depth conversations with specific leaders. You know, there's a landscape of problems and projects, and knowing which horse for which course, as my colleague says, which ones lend themselves to crowdsourcing, which ones lend themselves to, pair-based programming, which one lend themselves to one person toiling away all night, is really something that we need to do. But just as we made advances with protein folding because we were able to define what those hard scientific questions are that we want to solve, just as maths have a list of problems that mathematicians are always working to solve before you get the Fields Medal or whatever it is, we need a similar set of problems for democracy and for community and for development that we can solve with AI.
Fantastic. And on that note, we had our colleagues from MyMune, this platform that helps MUNs around the world connect, discussing what would happen if you include AI agents as negotiators in MUNs. And of course, some hesitation. Some young people will be uncomfortable with that for all kinds of reasons. But on the other hand, MUN is a wonderful sandbox, or as one of our colleagues put it, a petri dish, for testing what happens in these situations. And Mohanty, Do you see with agents, how far away are we from having negotiator agents or building them so that they would actually function reasonably well in an MUN setting?
Well, so we do have agents which can negotiate with each other on very simple topics, and we have seen clearly exponential progress in the capabilities of these models to a point where different projections say super intelligence is in a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that is. But within our lifetimes, we would have agents which will definitely be really good at negotiating just their standpoint. So then, even if the models right now are not as good, the agents right now are not as good at negotiating large complex treaties, we will still need to already start working on building the infrastructure in which we can both see how well these models negotiate, objectively measure it, and very patiently track the progress across variety of different negotiations of different complexities. That's why I also personally like the MUN infrastructure, because first we learned that there's 1 million students, young people all around the world who engage with these MUNs. Then there's across hundreds and thousands of these MUNs. Now, if we figure out what does that infrastructure look like, where the interactions in these is something that is equally, the interfaces also allow agents to participate, and we could also imagine a setup where someone who's evaluating these negotiations does not know if it's an agent or an actual student, and creating such experimental frameworks which will allow us to see how well these agents are good at negotiating will help me answer your question a lot more objectively when we speak about it a year from now. So I think then the goal is clear. Okay, let's go ahead and build that infrastructure. Even if the numbers are bad, we at least get a bad number and a clear direction of where we can head towards.
I think it's wonderful that you frame this issue, which seems like a moral issue about AI governance, into a scientific experiment to find out what works and what doesn't. I think this, as a scientist, I can only agree that's where we need to be starting. And then, based on the results, making decisions more in the moral sphere. Some of those decisions, the younger generation will have different views from us. Kids who are growing up now and making friends with AI agents. We know MUN, one of the aspects is the social aspect, the big party at the end, and you stay friends with people in different countries. Will you stay friends with agents? And then, of course, this question that I keep pushing you on, Beth. So, rights and responsibilities relative to those agents. If I turn off your best friend, what are the consequences? You'll be devastated, right? Because I've essentially killed your AI friend. Who's going to worry about that?
Well, we have seen debates around this issue that are more than philosophical when, again, companies have chosen to turn off the bots that people rely on for companionship, for psychotherapy, for more intimate relationships. But I confess, in my very mundane way, I am so preoccupied by the extraordinary challenges that actual humans are facing right now. Hunger, homelessness, disease, you name it. We're here in UN territory. Obviously, there's SDGs to capture each one of these challenges. So I am just, again, very preoccupied with the question of if there is anything we can do to address these very real challenges, including how we strengthen and improve our institutions, the institutions which we need to address challenges of health and wellness and climate change and poverty, et cetera, et cetera. It's only by fixing our institutions that we're going to fix these other challenges. And that's where MUN comes in. It's by thinking in an experimental and scientific and sandbox kind of way of how we can improve how our institutions work. And if we can safely do that in a model UN environment and learn from that for the real UN and for other institutions, how much more exciting is that, the opportunity to say, hey, we could experiment with new kinds of engagement, with new forms of collective intelligence, with new forms of negotiation that will, by the way, both help kids learn to sharpen their debate and forensic skills and how they argue and talk. But gee, if it really helps us to think about how we come to better solutions to problems that will avoid some of these challenges and improve lives, we have a desperate need to do this now.
Thank you. I think this is the right level at which to wind up here. So just to finish off, Beth, you're going to be here for a few more days at AI for Good and WISES. Anything you're particularly looking forward to from this conference?
Well, spending more time with you guys and figuring out what we can conspire to actually get more students involved in building AI for good. And again, convincing other institutional players that this is not a nice to have, it's a must have if we're going to train the next generation of leader and problem solver.
Thank you. I think that's a very high ideal. Let's try and get there. Thank you, Beth Noveck.